everyone. Today we're going to be covering eukaryotes and prokaryotes, which we find in the topic cells. Eukaryotes and prokaryotes. Eukaryotes and prokaryotes represents animal, plant, bacteria sort of cells, and you need to know which one is in which category. Eukaryotes, think about what it rhymes with. Eu. And what are we? We're animals. So all the animals, all the plants, fungi and protists as well, are types of eukaryotes. Prokaryotes are bacteria cells. Okay? And the main thing that you need to know for your exams for eukaryotes and prokaryotes are their similarities and their differences. Starting off with similarities, eukaryotes and prokaryotes, so your animal cells and your bacteria cells, they all have, so I'm going to write they both have cell membrane, cytoplasm, and ribosomes. They also have genetic material, which is like your DNA. However, the differences are that your bacteria cells, so your prokaryotes, are much, much smaller than the eukaryotes. So when you write comparisons, when you compare eukaryotes and prokaryotes, you have to make sure to use comparative languages to get the marks in an exam. So instead of saying prokaryotes are small, you got to say prokaryotes are smaller, right? Because you're comparing the two. So make sure you write the ER at the end to get that mark, right? So prokaryotes are smaller than eukaryotes. Another difference between them is eukaryotes, you find the DNA, you find that genetic material inside the nucleus. Whereas prokaryotes are so small that they don't even have a nucleus. The DNA is freely floating in cytoplasm. Again, for comparative sentences, you got to make sure you write both. So you would write eukaryotes have DNA inside the nucleus, but prokaryotes have DNA freely floating in the cytoplasm. Right, there is some more. So if I scroll down, so the next one. Prokaryotes and eukaryotes, because eukaryotes are much bigger, they have the space to contain the mitochondria and chloroplast. So eukaryotes have mitochondria and chloroplast. But prokaryotes do not. Do you see in every one of my sentences, I'm making sure I'm writing both sentences to get the marks in biology. So, but prokaryotes do not. There is something called plasmid DNA. I'm going to explain that in a little bit more detail in a second, but prokaryotes have plasmid DNA. But eukaryotes do not. And plasmid DNA is rings of really small DNA that they can transfer from one bacteria cell to another bacteria cell. So these are small circular DNA. I'll show you in a diagram in a second. Small circular DNA. So prokaryotes have those really small circular DNA, which can be transferred from one bacteria to another. One bacteria to another. But then eukaryotes don't have that. Right, so if I draw you a few diagrams, that will help you to understand a bit better. An example of eukaryote is our animal cell. So in our animal cell, we've got the nucleus. Inside the nucleus, we have the DNA. We've got mitochondria all around it. And then we've got ribosomes. Mitochondria, ribosomes, cell membrane, and cytoplasm. Now a bacteria cell, right? The size of that mitochondria is the same size as this bacteria. So remember that, right? The mitochondria, right? That's our mitochondria. And this bacteria are very similar in size. This bacteria has a cell wall, and then it has the cell membrane inside it. You don't have any nucleus. Instead, the DNA is a single loop just in the cytoplasm, freely floating. It's got really small ribosomes in it, and these small rings of DNA. We also tend to find that bacteria has these flagellums, which is just tails. So freely floating DNA. So no nucleus. That's one of our differences that we talked about. We've got this cell wall, which is similar to plant cells, but in plant, the cell wall is made up of cellulose. So in plant cells, cell wall is made from cellulose. But then in bacteria cells, the cell wall is not made from cellulose. That's all you have to know for this. You don't need to know in particular what it's made up of. You just need to know that it's not cellulose. So it's not the same cell wall as a plant, but it's got the cell wall to support its structure. Then we've got this flagellum. So another difference that you can talk about is bacteria has a flagellum, but eukaryotes do not. These are your plasmid DNA, the small rings of DNA. And they've got these cell membrane and these ribosomes, which is the same for eukaryotes. Ribosomes. Make sure you know how to draw this bacteria, and you make sure you know how to draw this animal cell as well, and also a plant cell. We call this freely floating DNA chromosomal DNA, which differentiates from the plasmid DNA. So we've got two types of DNA for the bacteria. One of the key questions that they would ask you is how we know that this bacteria used to be, or this mitochondria used to be a freely living bacteria. So they might ask you to give two evidence to suggest that the mitochondria, the chloroplast, were bacteria millions of years ago. So how do we know that? Evidence that mitochondria or chloroplast were freely living bacteria. So key points there. One thing, remember I said that they're very similar in their size. So similar in size is one of the reasons. And secondly, is the fact that this mitochondria also has its own DNA, and therefore it can reproduce itself independently from the cell dividing. So like bacteria, because the mitochondria can reproduce itself without the need of the animal cell splitting, we say that's another evidence that it was a bacteria back in the day. So contains its own DNA, so it can reproduce independently. That's it for this session. We're going to, in the next video, look at exam style questions on this eukaryotes and prokaryotes. Thank you.